So let's have a look where it all starts then. Where do we get insanity as a defence from? Well, the starting point is a very famous case, the McNaughton case. Oh, I should have put the date in there. It's 1843. So it's quite an old case. And McNaughton, the defendant in this instance, attempted to assassinate the then Prime Minister, a man called Robert Peel. And for those of you that are aware of that name, Robert Peel founded the modern police force. The defendant, however, missed, but ended up killing Peel's secretary, a man called Edward Drummond. Medical opinion at the time suggested that he was mentally ill, and this resulted in the House of Lords setting out rules for the use in such cases. And the legal principle, which is quite long, I'll read it out, says that if the accused was conscious that the act was one which he ought not to do, and if the act was at the same time contrary to law, he is punishable. That makes perfect sense, actually. In all cases of this kind, the jurors ought to be told that every man is presumed to be sane and to possess a sufficient degree of reason to be responsible for his crimes until the contrary can be proved to their satisfaction. So there's a basic presumption of sanity unless it can be proved that somebody is not sane. And in order to prove that they are insane, there are a number of things, the House of Lords said, that need to be shown. The first is, it must be clearly proved that at the time of committing the act, the party accused was labouring under such a defect of reason, caused from a disease of the mind, so as not to know the nature and the quality of the act he was doing, or as not to know that what he was doing was wrong. So, essentially, the House of Lords have said that there are sort of three things, I suppose, that are absolutely key to go through and to check off our list to make sure that somebody is or has a defence of insanity. In the first instance, they have to have a defect of reason. In the second instance, there has to be a disease of the mind. And both of those things need to lead to the point that the defendant does not know the nature and quality of his act, or the act that he was doing was wrong. So that's an or in there. All right, one of those two. So number one, number two, and these two here are number three. Okay, and we're going to look at each of these in turn. And on this video, I'll just deal with defect of reason, but we'll deal with the other two in later videos. So let's take a look at defect of reason. And the defect of reason is based on the inability to use the powers, not failing to use those powers of reason. So it's based on an inability to use powers of reason. I had to put on the end there, didn't I? Not failing to use those powers of reason. If the defendant is capable of reasoning but has failed to use those powers, then that's not a defect of reason. And we'll see that in a moment when we look at Clark. However, they may still have a defence in those instances if it can be shown that they did not have the mens rea. The defence will just not be insanity. So let's have a look at Clark then and see what Clark says about defect of reason. In Clark, the defendant was charged with theft after putting groceries in her bag. She was shoplifting. She claimed she acted absent-mindedly while suffering from depression. The trial judge I can't speak today. The trial judge ruled that this amounted to a defect of reason and raised insanity. It was held that a defect of reason required an inability to exercise reason rather than a failure to do so at a time which the exercise of reason was possible. The defendant in this case failed to exercise powers of reason but was not incapable of reasoning, thus was not within the scope of insanity. Now, she was found not guilty. We don't get that confused. She had no defence of insanity but was found not guilty for other reasons. But the key thing is, the judge says the defendant in this case failed to exercise the powers of reason but was not incapable of reasoning, thus was not within the scope of insanity. So that's the only thing to remember in terms of a defect of reason. It's based on an inability to use the powers of reason, not a failure to use them. Essentially, in simple terms, it means that you can't use those powers rather than choosing not to use them, if that makes sense. In the next video, we will look at what's termed as disease of the mind and what we mean by disease of the mind, and that gets slightly more complicated.